Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another exciting online session of World Civilizations 1. Now, we're still, of course, going to be concluding the chapter on sort of the turn of the millennium era in world history, but today we're going to focus mainly on what Africa and America were up to, while the four great spheres of influence, as we typically call them, were off doing their own thing, and becoming really the established influential places we know of throughout ancient history. Now, of course, to get things started, I do want to go through the key terms. In Africa, we're going to look at the Mali Empire and the Epic of Sundiata. In the Americas, we'll look at the Shamu Empire, the Toltec civilization, and the city of Cahokia in North America. However, of course, before we really get into all of that, I want to make sure you're aware of your important upcoming assignments. Since we have Thanksgiving break coming up, you don't have any assignments due until after Thanksgiving break. Now, these are, of course, going to be your 5th content quiz, which will be due on the 30th at 5 p.m., and your final essay outline, which will be due on November the 30th at 5 p.m. as well. The details for this final essay outline are, of course, located in the final essay prompt, which you can find within Blackboard. If you have any questions about any of these assignments, please feel free and run them by me as soon as possible. I won't be having as much office hours this week, obviously, because of Thanksgiving, but you're more than welcome to email me or anything like that to get in touch with me. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get into the Americas and Africa. To get things started, I want to kind of set up the context of pre-contact Africa and America by looking at the effects of the end of this isolation. So what I'd like you to do is to go ahead and read follow this link and read this following article. I'll also be sending you the link within Teams if you need to access it there. Once you do, I want you to be prepared to discuss the following questions. Was the world actually benefited by the opening up of the Americas and Africa? And should we be happy that this opening up occurred? Be prepared to participate and debate about this in future assignments, by the way. It will hopefully come up again. So, I'll give you a second to go ahead and get that link pulled up, pause this video, and go through it. Alright, very good. I'm going to assume you went ahead and did that, so let's go ahead and move on. Now, during this time period, as the title of this lesson indicates, Africa was actually seen to have sort of expanded its influence. One of the reasons this was one of the most significant events during this time period in African history was actually the spread of various trade routes across the Sahara Desert. Now, as a bit of a review, why would this be so important in increasing Africa's influence? Because we talked about the Sahara Desert a bit before. I'll figure out what to do during these pauses eventually. But yes, once again, students at home, if you remember, the Sahara Desert was, of course, enormous and takes up most of the entire northern African continent. This was the main reason historically that Egypt was really the only internationally significant civilization throughout most of the African continent. However, once these trade routes were finally able to cross the Sahara Desert, the rest of Africa was able to get involved in a more international society and economy. For example, the Mandi-speaking peoples became very prominent in West and Central Africa, essentially becoming the go-between between various civilizations in Western Africa and Eastern Africa. Now, as a reminder with India, why is this such a great position for a group of people to be in? Very good. Again, students, those of you who paid attention when we talked about India, they can essentially profit off of this trade because they're smack dab in the middle. Everyone else has to go through them when they're involved in this trade. They had a very similar setup to other civilizations we've looked at. Their political structure was a bit divided, like the Vedic peoples, for example. They would only have small local councils in the rainforests, but in the savannas they were capable of forming larger sacred kingships. Their trade was, of course, again, quite significant, dealing in things like pepper and nuts, and trading across with the Atlantic coast for iron goods and textiles. These Mandi peoples eventually organized into the Mali Empire, which was able to rule a significant portion of Western Africa from 1235 to 1670. The legendary origins of this empire are chronicled in the Epic of Sundiata. Sundiata was believed to be the prophesied ruler and redeemer of this homeland, and he was credited as being the one who defeated his enemies with a new African cavalry. He was believed, according to the epic, that he was crippled at birth, but walked through sheer willpower, and that he and his family had fled after his half-brother stole the throne. Now, you might of course argue that this story might not be entirely historically accurate. However, why would you want a founding story like this maybe? Alright, that of course is a bit more of a complicated question, so I'll help you guys out a little bit with it. Essentially, having a great mythical leader like this who seems to be above criticism and beyond reproach gives your rule a bit of legitimacy. If these rulers can trace themselves back to the great hero Sundiata, who again is a prophesied ruler from heaven trying to redeem your homeland, it would give you legitimacy to continue ruling this empire if you could say, hey, I'm descended from Sundiata, I'm essentially ruling with his blessing. It's very similarly to how a lot of times you probably had lessons as children overly romanticizing how great the founding fathers were. I'm not even going to go so far as to say they were terrible or anything like that, but if you study American history closely, they of course had their flaws. But if we paint them as very wonderful people without many flaws, it gives the American government more legitimacy as a result. The Mali Empire is essentially doing the exact same thing. An example of the significance of the Mali Empire can be seen in their ruler Mansa Musa, who ruled from 1312 to 1332. He was one of the rulers who took power after the Mali Empire kingship converted to Islam. He went on a Hajj or a pilgrimage to Mecca from 1224 to 1225, bringing along all of his soldiers, his wives, his consorts, and roughly 12,000 slaves through Cairo, Egypt on the way. This, of course, is a great way for him to distribute his wealth, and is credited as being one of the events that essentially helped to put Western Africa on the map, and helped draw communities outside of Egypt and Africa to the attention of the world as a whole. A couple of examples: the Mali had great trading cities. You have Jinn, which is a trading city for salt, gold, and slaves, and Timbuktu, which you might have heard of, which became one of the great commercial, intellectual, and religious centers of Africa. 3 of which still stand, by the way, one of which you can see in this picture right here. So again, quite a significant empire that we typically don't pay a whole lot of attention to. Which is one reason I like to focus on things like this, because typically our world history classes only focus on really European stuff or just the main civilizations that drew European or American attention. It is important to recognize that other parts of the world had things going on and weren't just primitive civilizations that Europeans later brought civilization to. They already had things going on. But in the meantime, we will look just a little bit at East African trade. Again, very beneficial spot of trading in a central location. East Africa was able to trade with Arabia, the Persian Gulf, and West India, trading all sorts of things like ivory, gold, and slaves, and having various great trading centers all along the coast, as you can see here. Now, the African slavery was also quite significant before Columbus arrived. The Quran, for example, which still religiously governed most of northern Africa, only required owners to treat their slaves kindly, and did praise masters who freed their slaves, but it didn't require it. Slaves at this time were mostly captured from war or convicted of crimes, and could work at all sorts of various jobs throughout Africa. However, plantation slavery was considered to be the worst, with the Zanj Rebellion showing this pretty well, with African slaves revolting in Iraq to protest their working conditions. Now, as a bit of review, why is plantation slavery typically or particularly so bad? Very good again, students who are paying attention when we talk about Alexander the Great. Plantation slavery is, of course, the system where slaves are typically treated just as property and have no rights. This, of course, leads to many abuses against them, lots of violence to get them to work, and horrible working conditions. So again, even though plantation slavery wasn't as widespread as it would become with European involvement, it was still a thing throughout portions of Africa. Now, with that, we'll go ahead and transition into some South American societies. Also, like some of the civilizations in Africa, we typically don't really focus upon these, but there were actually various successful South American civilizations as well that didn't quite attract European attention. For example, you have the Shamu Empire of 900 to 1470, which was the first empire in all of South America and was located on the western coast of the continent. One of the reasons this empire was so successful, it was highly commercialized. There was a deliberate attempt to try to buy and sell things for profit and to innovate and improve the economy. For example, there were complex and continuously maintained irrigation and canal systems. Government officials oversaw the construction of important infrastructure, and cotton became an international export, even though it could only be transported by llamas at the time. One example of the greatness of this empire was the city of Chanshan, which was their largest city at 30,000 people, which may not seem like a lot when compared with things like the city of Rome, for example, but keep in mind, South America, this empire is able to accomplish all of this while being cut off from the majority of the world, essentially. They can really only interact with people in South America at this time. The city had 10 palaces, all surrounded by 30-foot high walls, and contained palaces with grand burial areas for their rulers, such as other civilizations we have looked at. So again, these pre-contact empires typically don't get a lot of attention, but they do demonstrate that various portions of the world we typically don't recognize were civilized before Europeans got involved. Now, in the meantime, since we don't have time to talk much about the Mayans, I would like to introduce you to their culture and their religion a little bit. So what I'd like you to do is follow this video right here, which explains some of the mythical origins behind the Mayans' famous ball game, and sort of compare and contrast these beliefs with other religious beliefs and legends we've talked about previously in the course. So again, I'll go ahead and give you a second to do that. Alright, I'm going to assume you went ahead and did that. Sorry, I thought I just heard my smoke detector. I got a little bit scared. But as of now, I think we're going to be okay. But anyway, so again, hopefully you noticed maybe some similarities, things like the levels in hell and the Mayan underworld, things of that nature. But again, that should hopefully give you a bit of a better understanding of what the Mayans were all about. In the meantime, let's go ahead and look at the Toltecs. The Toltecs were arguably, from a historical standpoint, actually even more successful and influential than the Mayans. They were an empire in most of central Mexico from about 900 to 1570. They were actually the civilization which replaced the Mayans after their civilization mysteriously vanished and or was probably abducted by aliens. Their capital city was even more significant than Chanshan, with about 60,000 people at its height. Well, one of the reasons they were so successful is that they were able to borrow their pyramids, their ball courts, their architecture, and their various art styles from the Mayans and another civilization that I can't quite pronounce, to be quite honest with you. So again, for example, this shows why civilizations like the Vedic peoples we looked at had such a tough time. When you're a civilization like the Vedics, or just first trying to get started, I'm going the wrong way, like the Mandi peoples, it takes you a bit longer because you essentially have to build everything from scratch. The Toltecs were able to be successful pretty early on because they could just copy or innovate everything the Mayans left behind. For example, the Toltecs did have a successful trading system. They traded maize, beans, squash, deer, rabbit, and dog all across South America. Yes, that is dog, by the way. Very disgusting, but it's what they did to get by. Now, to wrap things up with the Americas, we will talk about indigenous peoples in North America. The city of Cahokia was considered to be the most significant civilization in much of early North American history. This city was settled around 600 CE on the coast of the Mississippi River, near modern-day St. Louis. Now, this is probably a bit of an obvious review, but why would you probably want to start a city in a place like this? Very good, audience at home. This is once again showing the importance of rivers. Like many of the early civilizations we discussed in early Mesoamerica, if you start by a river, you have access to water for your crops and your own survival and your livestock, and of course you can use it to trade. Sorry, I just repeated myself. My brain kind of fizzed out for a minute. But again, having access to a river, especially one as large and heavy flowing as the Mississippi River, can help you with all sorts of survival and trading needs. To give you an idea of what the city was like, even without a sort of an empire surrounding it, it reached a 15,000 population at its height, which, to give it a bit more respect, would also be the same population as London around the same time. So while again, it's not very large compared to some of the ancient civilizations we've discussed, It is quite significant for a city that's not part of an empire. However, it did eventually become part of a sort of a confederation, for lack of a better word. Satellite towns would eventually form outside of Cahokia due to the growing excess harvest. They would essentially hold the harvest. The city wasn't big enough to hold by itself. This led to a trading relationship between the Cahokia and the hinterlands, or the satellite towns. They would produce the food staples Cahokia needed to survive, mostly maize, while Cahokia would send their crafts and their manufactured goods down the Mississippi River to trade with the hinterlands. Now, is this a good economic system, do you think? As some of you may have noticed, again, very good students at home, it does seem a bit similar to the North's relationship with the South in the pre-antebellum America. It can be a great system because you essentially have two groups satisfying each other's needs, but it does lead to a little bit of dependency, as you may have noticed. If one of these groups has issues or falls apart, that is going to negatively affect the other. So, for example, if the hinterlands have an issue with their crops, Cahokia is going to potentially face famine. If Cahokia can't send these crafts down to the hinterlands, they're not going to be able to might not be able to produce the crops Cahokia needs, which leads to a self-destructive cycle. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, one of the things you may be more aware of with Cahokia is their famous earth mounds. These are artificially constructed hills that you can see here, intended to honor either the spiritual forces or some leader of Cahokia. Now, one of the things that make these most impressive is that they were constructed without labor animals. So they were completely created just by human labor. Now, if those of you have ever seen, if any of you have ever seen any of these, please let me know. For example, the various tribes like the Cherokee, even after Cahokia collapsed, took these burial mound methods and started using them in their civilizations. So if any of you live near any Cherokee sites, for example, you may have seen one like these. There actually was one in my hometown until I believe the early 90s. But anyway, to wrap things up, one of the things to get into the fall of Cahokia I want to talk about is potentially being a victim of your own success. Is it possible for an economy to become too successful? How could overproduction maybe lead to the downfall of an economy? I'll give you a bit of a longer pause on this one to admire possibly one of the worst musicians I've ever heard in my life, but that's just a personal opinion. Very good. Again, those of you who maybe study the economy in here, this could of course lead to potential oversaturation. If you overproduce in an economy, that's going to lower the demand for your goods, which is going to lower prices and hurt trade all across the board. So essentially, arguably, Cahokia became too successful, and so demands across this trading relationship started to fall, which of course would hurt the entire economy as a whole. Also, of course, overproduction can lead to more environmental issues, which we will also discuss in just a second. This overproduction also led to a couple of issues that led to the abandonment of Cahokia. Specifically, you have the cutting of woodlands, which of course is a common problem in various economies, which leads to the loss of soil nutrients, and timber and food become scarce across the board. Also, the Native American trading system at the time could not keep up with all the production that was being made. Even though they had the entire Mississippi River at their disposal, like I mentioned, they were still only using canoes. While canoes can be very effective in traveling down rivers in North America, due to their small size, they're not very effective trading vessels. So because of this, however much Cahokia could produce, trading was always going to be a bit limited. This led to Cahokia mainly being abandoned by about 1350, which is one of the main reasons we don't typically give it a lot of attention in world history or American courses. But again, despite it being abandoned, it was quite successful at its height. But in the meantime, last thing I'd like you to ponder is whether or not what we've talked about today would justify America and Africa being included in the 4 global spheres of influence. If it wasn't, why not? But in the meantime, just remember again these upcoming assignments and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.